Can you hear me? Great, wonderful. So I want to first thank Mel Chen and the collective for envisioning the conference and making it happen. I used to believe that places like Berkeley, things like this happened all the time, every day. And so it's with a lot of gratitude and recognition of the hard work and the resources that go into making something like this happen, to know that it's been maybe 7 or 8 years since there's been a kind of larger conversation around the sexual cultures community. Not to say there haven't been many other possibilities, but to bring together a range of people here to share our work is really important. And in this room, to share forms of creativity. So obviously, there's a lot of stuff in the room. Make use of it. I mean, while we're talking and thinking through these issues. I also want to thank Suzanne for her labor and all the other people that brought this to fruition. So my contribution today is around a project around the challenges of fugitivity and the quest for seeking refuge. And I'm going to be thinking about that very concretely, about struggles that are reverberating in our time, in our moment, and to which I'll share with you a little bit in the middle of the presentation how I got here, but I want to just plunge in because, in fact, it seems like all kinds of people are plunging into the story here. Reverberating the last 2 weeks in right-wing fueled media panics and in President Trump's furious tweeting denouncing the caravan of migrants traveling from Central America through Mexico, we have a sense of this larger struggle around fugitivity and migrancy, around the quest for seeking refuge and the obstacles to it. Pueblos Sin Fronteras has been organizing annual caravans since 2010 to draw attention to struggles to seek asylum and refuge. These are part of a long legacy of caravans, actually, some of which originated in the 1980s. And they are using a range of different communities and possibilities to literally create and recreate the sort of Christian Stations on the Cross solidarity and humanitarian marches to provide forms of protection from gangs, for migrants who are trying to escape from gangs and corrupt law enforcement, to produce visibility for the kinds of struggles of migration, and also to produce care. And to engage that process, this latest year, the caravan had 1,500 people approximately at start in March 25th when people crossed the Guatemalan border. And the numbers included more than 300 children and women. And by the time that President Trump was tweeting about it, it was down to about 1,050. These were people that were coming through a process of seeking asylum in Mexico, or perhaps seeking asylum in the United States. They were being aided and assisted in many different ways by different kinds of solidarity campaigns so that they would be able to safely cross 2,000 miles and come to various different destinations. Last year, the final destination was Tijuana, where a small number of caravan members were expected to apply for U.S. asylum. That is, that they were expected to present themselves at the border and go through regular procedures to do so. And they had often received a lot of guidance and assistance in doing so to make sure that they were successful in their claims. In 2017, 108 caravans arrived in groups at the U.S. border. They were from people from Cameroon, El Salvador, Guatemala, Guinea, Honduras, Mexico, Nicaragua, Sierra Leone. 48 of them were children. Half of the people who came accompanied with their children, adults that came accompanied with their children, were put in detention for more than 6 to 10 months. This year, the numbers of the people who were in the caravan were disproportionately from Honduras, which remains in political upheaval after the US-backed right-wing President Juan Hernandez was inaugurated for a second term despite allegations of widespread election rigging in November. The real-time effects of US foreign policy, not just of this moment, but also in the 2009 coup in Honduras, have unleashed waves of repression and economic violence and political prisoners, not to mention the ways in which the United States has been forcibly removing and deporting people back to Central America. Now, this is part of a larger process, like everything in the Trump moment, in the sense that it becomes sort of crystallized in one particularly crazy man and his articulations, but it's part of a longer history and struggle. And I think it's really important for us to understand that. And many people, I'm sure, in this room actually acutely understand it. But I want to work through some of the different possibilities here. In the 1980s and 1990s, the number of refugees from Central America, Africa, and Asia in the wake of brutal military dictatorships, political repression, and economic and social crises were escalating. Australia, the United States, and Western Europe, in many ways in coordination and in tandem, aggressively implemented systems of indefinite detention for asylum seekers and made access to asylum appeal much more challenging. They also created different forms of trying to keep migrants off their shores and out of their borders by extending the regimes of militarized border control well beyond their actual borders. The policies and politics were bolstered by fears of uncontrolled migration that would lead to social and economic breakdown. They intensified and prolonged carceral detention and arbitrary deferment of review as part of a process that Alison Muntz has described as, quote, criminalizing asylum seekers as threats to security. So what I want to do today is actually apply the analytic of fugitivity to the experiences of refugees to illuminate both the sort of experiences of the geographies of flight and the dangers of capture, and also to sort of speak to this idea and process of seeking refuge and the different kinds of ways in which the sort of negotiating of legal and militarized regimes in order to do so. So fugitivity and taking flight is a signature idiom of Black diasporic culture and scholarship that reverberates with affective conditions and consequences of people who flee persecution, endemic and brutal violence in intolerable circumstances. There are many, many different ways in which the kinds of scholarship about fugitivity both is instantiated deeply and materially in histories of slavery and emancipation and the struggle for freedom. And it also works in many different ways laterally. And I want to sort of speak to its lateral possibilities and apply this with a kind of appreciation for historical specificity, but also for an appreciation of what we can do and think about in this present moment, and also recognize in terms of political struggles. So it's particularly apt for those who are fleeing extortion, assaults, predation from gangs and military in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, and among those thousands who have fled the escalation of violence in the last 2 decades. These children and women are dodging violence and navigating coyotes. They're navigating narcotic transport militias, police, and seeking protection in the company of a variety of different men, women, children from charitable groups across Mexico, the United States, from people from Canada and humanitarian groups from all over. Since 2014, when the Obama administration reinstated detention, which had been something that had been part of a feature of the Bush administration, children and women have been detained in a carceral archipelago of local jails, shelters, and for-profit detention centers. Tracing their experiences of fugitivity and capture offers fuel to a deeper and widespread critique of state violence and exploitation. Fugitive existence, capture, and premature death, as Ruthie Gilmore has bracingly addressed, establishes a relationship between those seeking refuge and prison and detention systems that confine and place one in vulnerable, precarious, and devalued status. And just to give you a sort of sense of the larger scope of this as a problem and challenge, the United Nations has estimated that the global population of those who are forcibly displaced has tripled from 21 million in 2005 to 65 and 67 million in 2016 and 17. The term forcibly displaced, asylum seekers, refugees are all legal and state categories. They're consequential to both the violence that encircles the geographies of flight and harm and precarity, as well as the ways in which we understand their situation through media and through different kinds of ways in which they enter a kind of legal state system. The journalistic narrative I'm going to share with you of Grace and her daughter who fled extortion and death threats from gang members in El Salvador in 2007 is part of this sort of circle. And I wanted to sort of show you these maps because they really do indicate the range of different routes of movement in which migrants from Central America, but also migrants from the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia are traveling through these particular routes to arrive at different kinds of locations in which they might find degrees of support or possibilities of shelter and mobility and further mobility. So Grace was following her husband, who was already living in the United States, in Long Island. After being apprehended near the border, she was put in detention and deported back to El Salvador. In 2014, she returned with her daughter and thousands of other women and children fleeing escalating violence in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And she came and spent 14 months in the United States, held and transferred from one detention center to the other in New Mexico, Texas, Louisiana. In March 2015, Grace, along with 78 mothers, went on hunger strike at Karnes County Detention Center in southeast of San Antonio, Texas, which holds women and children. And they protested their internal detention, the denial of bail, and in some cases separation from their children. In statements issued in Spanish, they protested collectively in the, quote, name of mothers and beseeched authorities to set them free and set free our children. It's through different kinds of legal advocacy and humanitarian groups that we actually know about their struggles and about the ways in which their individual stories became circulated in a larger community, both in Texas and around the United States. And their intention of these struggles was to both engender different forms of support, but also to sort of make the public see and feel our desperation. The women blamed their children's weight loss, their deteriorating health, their depression on the misery of incarceration. They challenged the cruelty of refused asylum and deportation, and refugee advocates communicated within different kinds of print and television media how these hunger striking women were actually struggling and what they were actually asking for. Issues that were kept concealed and privatized both by the private industries that actually held the women as well as the federal government. So they were also, during this time of their hunger strike, many of the women were taken to medical clinics and they were held overnight away from their children. The nurses and guards warned them that they would lose custody of their children as a result of participating in the strike, that children would be removed into foster care in the United States. They contended that self-starvation would reduce, quote, their brain functioning and make them, quote, unfit guardians for their children. The harm and debility of detention galvanized advocates, lawyers, and judges to challenge the grounds of detention and on the basis of whether a prison can serve as a safe, viable, and licensed place of care for children. So this was a legal strategy. It was successful. The US courts in California intervened to condemn the private prison facilities that were not licensed to take care of children and force the US Homeland Security not only to release children but also their mothers on parole in order to assure the semblance of viable domestic life for the children. Federal officials responded to the order to release the mothers by outfitting the mothers with ankle monitors, which extended the carceral geography that kept them under surveillance. The irony is the carceral geography brands them as people who are making claims to being victims of violence as parolees and putative criminals. Grace claimed that the parole presented a false freedom since it was, quote, the same psychological game as detention, ominously a reminder of deportation. Fugitivity both spotlights the structures of carceral control and also illuminates the daily processes of struggle, evasion, and survival. Jessica Lorenzano, a gender-variant youth, was forced to flee her family in Guatemala from where her father had abused her. The failure of domestic safety in those circumstances propelled her flight from her home on a bus and across borders as a queer nomadic child, first to Santa Ana, El Salvador. For 8 years, and Lorenzano was 9 when this first emerged. For 8 years, Lorenzano sold bread rolls on the streets, slept in abandoned buildings with other homeless youth, sniffed glue out of paper bags. She dodged gang members seeking payoffs and the police. She was badly assaulted by gang members, and the police arrested her. They released her into juvenile detention. And she took cargo trains through Mexico, along with meeting friends and making her way to the US-Mexico border. In the final brutal 8-day walk through the Sonoran Desert and into Arizona, she made it to Tucson. In Tucson, she found shelters that would give her a bed for the night, food, and medicine. She met other queer people in the city, and 3 months after her immigration arrival, she was detained while walking down the street in downtown Tucson. After 12 days in detention, she was deported by plane to Guatemala. 24 hours later, she went back on the road to Mexico. She spent 6 years working a range of informal and exploitative odd jobs, maintenance work at a baseball stadium, cell phone battery factory. She lived with a man for 2 years before his worsening drug addiction left her, fearing for her physical safety. This fugitive mode of life thrives on these strategies of transience, of overcoming trauma and vigilance against violence, and defying carceral control, but constantly dodging different kinds of people who are going to place you within that system of detention or jailing. Survival depends on seeking and cultivating fragile ties and temporary refuge. These journeys document the precarity of survival, and through displacements from home, sexual and gender vulnerability to abuse and violence, and the aggravation of informal economic transactions and labor exploitation, in many ways, Lorenzano made her way. And even in this process, when she finally ultimately returned to Mexico City after a number of years, friends introduced her to Julio Cuevas, a gay man who had migrated from El Salvador 2 years earlier and started Migrantes LGBT, an advocacy organization that offered resources for lesbian, gay, transgender immigrants in Mexico. He got her a bed in Casa Tuchan, a halfway home for Central American immigrants who provides beds and food and group therapy. They provide that group therapy with psychology students from the National University in Mexico and educational programming that includes workshops on legal rights and English classes for the possibility of more effective asylum seeking. NGO shelters and charitable support organizations are guiding asylum seekers on framing their narratives of trauma, of sexual violence and identity in ways that are legible in asylum proceedings. It's a process that has been happening in a variety of different ways since the 1990s, where in the US and Canada and Western Europe and Australia, refugee protections have been extended tentatively and unevenly to lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender persons from very specific nation states and who can make claims about the culture of those nation states in documenting their individual threats of physical and psychological and sexual violence in both their families, but more important, and I underline, in their societies. The access of refugee protections, which are organized around credible and objective fears of persecution, enlist many people who are academics who study these societies and communities in order to actually help make it possible for people to seek different kinds of safety, even despite discriminatory prohibitions for gay, lesbian, and trans people in those very countries to which they are seeking asylum. These resources that address the precarity of migrant survival are not simply about giving voice to individual stories of trauma and violence exploitation, but also a kind of materializing of the recognition, no están solo, you are not alone, a prevalent slogan to mobilize public support for refugees in indefinite detention and desperation. Now, how did I come to this research? I am not a scholar who has done a great deal of work before this on refugee struggles. I came to this project because I was studying mass hunger strikes from 1909 to the present moment. I was trying to understand the struggle for bodily defiance across the globe that tested carceral institutions and precipitated crises of medical care and crises of political solidarity and political possibility. In the 20th century, hunger striking has moved from the isolation of prison into the public stage, becoming central to many struggles of political defiance. Political allies have harnessed print and television media, amplifying through press accounts, public rallies, and sympathy fasts the perspective and bodily experience of prisoners. The struggle of hunger strikers captivates the public in particular circumstances, not always. Not all hunger, not all struggle activates concern. It's something of what I'm trying to understand about how it is that certain kinds of struggles fuel controversy, quicken the prisoner's political goals of mobility and freedom, and removal from detention. The last chapters of the book explore the intersectional strategies and challenges of creating alliances of solidarity for migrants and refugees with publics in the United States, Europe, and Australia. And I was really thinking a lot about Cathy Cohen's work, which was very influential to me when it was published 20 years ago in Punk's Bulldaggers and Welfare Queens, the questions of the radical potential of queer politics, which appeared in GLQ 20 years ago. Cathy Cohen did something that I thought was really important at the time and continues to reverberate, which is that she tried to galvanize a sense of these kinds of struggles that situated queer politics in the 1990s against a defiance against normativity, and yet ignored the trenchant power of racialization that collapsed variant sexualities and gender into reductive categories of straight and queer. Cohen wanted to put intersectional analysis into the practice of coalition building to embrace and proliferate potential allies across difference and honing focus on targeting, quote, the marginalized relationship to dominant power, which normalizes, legitimates, and privileges, and also pathologizes, denigrates, and demonizes people and life worlds. I like to carry her provocation of the question of the radical potential of queer politics to try to illuminate different kinds of coalitional work that is being done. And I want to do that by first beginning with returning to the caravan and talk about one of the strategies that has been quite fascinating about how leverages mobility as a means of producing spectacle of public protest. And I want to look at the Sikh Freedom Ride organized in April 2014 in response to hunger-striking Punjabi asylum seekers who spent 8 months or over a year in El Paso Detention Center in spite of passing credible fear interviews. The Jakara Youth Movement in Fresno organized a caravan to draw attention to the struggles of hunger-striking detainees. Deep Singh, co-founder of Jakara, explains that the inspiration to take action for El Paso detainees in their discussion came out of their discussions with Fresno-based Mexican-American and Hmong groups that underlined their common issues in different communities that were riven by straight surveillance, immigration, deportation, and incarceration. The organizing structure of these caravans created a durational and spatial protest that dramatized the urgency of mobility, drew attention to rallies that publicized the struggle for and solidarity of isolated detainees. Its work was both in the moment, as Sikh youth traveled to gurdwaras in Bakersfield and service organizations in Tacoma to rally support in ethnic and religious communities for Punjabi detained immigrants. They were also in rallies organized in Los Angeles communities of Artesia, where youth shared the stage with Latinx and South Asian activists. but they also were emerging in different kinds of social media. And so the sort of travel of the caravan made it through a different set of registers of solidarity and just attention through different kinds of social media platforms. And so one of the organizations that was sort of central to this was 18 Million Rising. And Caden Mock, who identifies as mixed race and transgender, leads this Asian American activist organization and created the hashtag, the El Paso 54. Sometimes it was the El Paso 37, because there are many different groups of people that went hunger striking to give the caravan a kind of digital platform for forms of activism that publicize this struggle, but also sort of gave you a sense of the different struggles of Middle Eastern, African, Central American refugee asylum seekers and their detention struggles. These alliances between these youth organizations of South Asian descent, Latinx, and Hmong youth put into practice Kathy Cohen's call to build coalitions that recognized race, ethnic, spiritual, sexual identities, and bridged shared experiences of oppression and challenged immigration, policing, and carceral systems. Rather than focusing on identity as a limit to creating collective purpose, the networks emphasized intersectional practices of alliance building that could question the kinds of normalizing of immigrant threats to securitized citizens and its reliance on enduring logics of racialized and sexualized criminality. These challenges, in many ways, are in the moment. They're ephemeral. They sort of hit and sort of locate different kinds of groups who see a connection to a larger set of struggles and may not see them beyond what they think of as a community of their affiliation until they begin to see how they reverberate alongside others. And it's these kinds of struggles that I want to also continue to point to in terms of the challenges of these kinds of alliance buildings that reverberate in the decisions of Latinx activists Dianara Garcia, Jorge Gutierrez, and Janesset Gutierrez in May 2016, who launched a hunger strike in a city park outside of Santa Ana Jail in Orange County after months of protests and negotiations on behalf of transgender immigrants facing deportation. They were protesting alongside and with a whole range of different organizations within Orange County, and they were trying to demand the Santa Ana City Council terminate its contract to ICE that holds trans immigrants in its 64-bed segregated pods facilities that were specifically designed and repurposed to detain trans and queer women as a kind of niche market in the carceral economy. The protests emphasized the structural racism of mass incarceration and immigrant detention as also a trans, queer, Latinx justice and freedom struggle. They contested the ways in which Santa Ana prison authorities claimed for the safety of the facilities for trans immigrants with a recognition of their pernicious possibility and also of their relationship to carcerality and debt. Jorge Gutierrez, a 31-year-old transgender immigrant rights activist who founded Familia TQLM, questioned the $27 million debt servicing needs that propelled the need for revenue and the city's contracts to harvest $7 million a year from the federal government for holding trans and queer immigrants. He argued, you know what's the best place for our queer and trans brothers and sisters? It's with their communities. In detention, no matter where, we are harassed, we are made fun of, we are threatened, we are misgendered. We are denied medical access. If you complain about this, they put you in solitary confinement. And they say it's for your safety, and that is punishment. I believe that is torture. Trans women who have been detained verify this. Human Rights Watch reports verify this. This targeting of trans people and trying to put them in a place where they could be safe is part of the struggle that they're trying to upend around trying to think through the very process in which they're putting their bodies on the line to protect precarious communities and families. It's part of what they articulated as Jorge and Jenna articulated as part of a national fight to stop raids and deportation and close down detention centers. Now, it's true that they were successful with the city council on one level, and then the county went back and sort of said, oh, we'll take the contract. And the city went to take contracts for deportees that are being brought into the city through other different kinds of federal marshals and other groups. So there's a whole range of different ways in which, even though they stopped the contract with ICE, they still struggle with other different kinds of ways in which that's moving forward. But putting people on the line, putting one's body on the line, echoes this kind of national mass hunger strikes that had occurred 6 months before and keep on reverberating through the system of detention, in which hundreds of Punjabi, Bangladeshi, Ghanaian, Central American, Colombian, Ecuadorian detainees have participated in a range of different facilities. And these kinds of struggles continue, in ways that still rely upon this idea that by producing degrees of publicity for the people that are involved, a kind of way of sort of motivating and actualizing a recognition that people are suffering and struggling in different kinds of settings, and also sort of trying to take some part of their story and make it part of a campaign that goes on outside of prison is part of this process. And it seems on many levels to be this kind of continual jag, which in some ways can be very dispiriting, and in other ways provides us these opportunities for understanding the creative ways in which these campaigns against detention and deportation make possible different forms of support and solidarity and connection in ways that allow for different people to appreciate both within and outside the kinds of connections that are emerging out of this carceral system that produces people of color as queer and deviant and dangerous to justify their intensified and extended cycles of incarceration. In December of 2015 at Yuba County Jail, 6 women prisoners joined in a hunger strike to support Rajeshri Roy, who faced deportation to Fiji, even though she was 8 when she came to the United States. Roy came to the US to join her father after being abandoned by her mother and abused by her relatives. At 16, she was arrested for robbery and battery. Once released from prison, she struggled to survive and fed her children while in an abusive relationship. She was arrested for misdemeanor petty theft. Due to her prior convictions, the DA in Yuba County set bail at $1 million and offered her 25 years to life sentence as a plea deal, and then brought it down to 7 years for her to be released in 2011. She won early release, or a plea deal, and she was incarcerated in 2011. When she was released in November 2014 on an early release, when she stepped foot out of jail, she was picked up by ICE and slated for deportation back to Fiji, away from her children. In Yuba County, she organized with women in prison on a variety of convictions. Roy and her fellow hunger strikers at Yuba County Jail issued a statement. "We are locked up together and refuse to be divided into immigrants and citizens. None of us belongs in this cage, separated from our families. We join the brave immigrant hunger strikers across the country in fasting to force recognition of our humanity." Roy received free legal representation, and her struggle was publicized by Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus, which works with low-income Asian Pacific Islander immigrants in deportation proceedings. Members of a youth group that was associated with it also conducted different kinds of solidarity fasts outside the jail and insisted on a larger struggle against unjust policing and the criminalization of all communities of color. In 2016, when Roy was released from detention, she became an activist. She advocated for those in detention and lobbied legislatures for alternative justice reforms for people in detention and for trying to make possible different kinds of possibilities for those who are in incarceration to make them less vulnerable to deportation, at least in the state of California. These different kinds of elements of creative and conscious movement building, initiated through the prisms of ethnic, gender, and sexual identity have the capacity to share resources and concerns, to forge networks of alliances and support. The political activism and social media spotlight the well-being of particular immigrant detainees, and the process poignantly reveals the pervasive carceral system's inhumanity. Pueblos Sin Fronteras had themselves, over the last decade, evolved and transformed as a kind of organization that was involved in those caravans that are working their way through Mexico and to the United States. In the statement they issued this year, at the very beginning, they said the caravan itself represents a group of people from different nations, religions, genders, gender expressions, sexual orientations, migrating and seeking refuge. They are facing violence, militarized and police persecution, and the threat of detention at every stage. They borrow, in many ways, from struggles against the prison industrial complex, policing, and criminalization. In local jails, populations share similar struggles against structures of unjust policy, anemic legal recourse, widespread criminalization, and vulnerability to violence and relentless caging and confinement. These critiques of the prison system, communicated through allies and advocates, reverberates to challenge how prison industrial complex polices gender normativity, punishes gender and sexual deviance, and destroys and distorts kinship and social worlds of people of color. The grounds of struggle, however, also feed dreams of prison abolition across identities and location. And this makes me wonder in different ways about Jose Muñoz's call for the process of disidentification, that I want to sort of emphasize scrambles and reconstructs encoded meanings that expose, quote, the universalizing and exclusionary mechanisms, and uses this recognition as, quote, a raw material for representing disempowered politics or positionality that has been rendered unthinkable by the dominant culture. To make possible the unthinkable involves reckoning with the legacies of widespread racial exclusion and violence, of technologies of estrangement that persist in ignoring and devaluing variation and divergence in human life, in relations, and society. Charting alternate genealogies and epistemologies of dissident and variant sexualities and genders requires overcoming the powers of narrative and knowledge production that have justified colonial power for centuries. The breadth of fugitive and generative practices of world-making emerges through imagining and performing, pursuing memory and archival traces through rituals and embodiment and vitalizing lifeways. Simultaneously, we are haunted by the historical forces of racialization, colonialism, and capital that saturate the experiences of estrangement of our bodies, gender expressions, and passions. Queer dreamers, Black Lives Matter, Pueblos Sin Fronteras activists emphasize enduring historical legacies of racialized and sexualized brutality in contemporary struggles to fight police violence and criminalization of Black and brown people and undocumented immigrants, of trans people, of queer folk. Drawing upon strategies of public defiance and disclosure, and yet mindful of risk, queer, trans, and color activists are trying to connect protests over racist and anti-trans and queer denigration with struggles for justice, freedom, and the ability to exercise liberty and mobility and bodily expression, and demanding respect for both our collective and our bodily worth and value. It is a process, and tenuous at best, precarious always, of seeking refuge in a world riven with different kinds of violence, but also for a hunger for community, for sustaining life worlds that embrace care and solidarity and the fullness of possibility. And so I'm going to just leave you with that as a way of sort of suggesting that there is both deep and enduring violence and difficulty and struggle, but that there is also this other possibility of what it means to think the unthinkable, to raise the possibility of carrying across one's own possibility and generating alternatives that may change the world that we know now. Thank you.